Hello, welcome to Walk in the Park. My name's Tony Ingram, and the date is the 22nd of February in 2017. You want to see all of my Walk in the Park shows, this weekly show on Ithaca's public access television station, Channel 13, Pegasus Studios. Go to my video blog, walkinthepark.tv. That's the URL, walkinthepark.tv. And you can see all of my shows. This is episode 160. So this week we are going to go look at, well, first we're going to start off and look at a couple of waterfalls and compare them across the seasons. And then we're going to go to Sampson State Park up on Seneca Lake, south of Seneca Falls in Seneca County, and take a look at some very interesting couple of museums there and other things in the park. So we'll start off. We'll go to Buttermilk Falls and see what been going on there. So this is early in the month. They're actually going to compare a couple of different dates of the flow at Buttermilk Falls. Buttermilk Falls and Buttermilk Falls State Park right here in Ithaca. So that's kind of the way we like to see the falls, that amount of water on it. It's full across the falls, but it's not muddy and it's not frozen. So we've had a very mild second half of the winter here, or middle of the winter, I guess I should say, February. And so a lot of flow, a lot of melt, and that's going to continue for a few days. Let's take a look at what it was like. Oh, let's see, when was this? This would be... Okay, this was a year ago, I guess. Yeah, this was a year ago in February when we had a lot of rain and snowmelt. So let's look at this one. Look at that picture. We'll bring this to life. So this time of year, we get a lot of, we've had some thaws, it turns out, and obviously this was a year ago. It's also a mild winter. Sometimes the water can get really high from snow melt and rain, and it can be a little dangerous. If you were in that flow, you would probably not survive it. It would rip you along and pull you under, and it would be so cold, as has happened to people. And also when we get, like last weekend, I was at the park taking some pictures and so forth, and the parking lot was full. And people were on the trails that were open, but I'm sure people were also going up in the gorge. And up in the gorge, there is ice. There's lots of ice that'll build up on the trails, and we've had some tragedies in the past where people have slipped into the stream and drowned. So not a good time of year to do that. You have to wait till probably later in April. Once they've opened the gorge, they've cleared the trails, and they've cleared all the fallen rock and falling rock, loose rock on the cliffs that it gets loosened up by the winter frost. They do what's called scaling. And we'll talk about that more later this spring in another episode. But they have to take the rock off the cliff over the trail to make it safe. Otherwise, you can get hit in the head. So that's another danger. So let's take a look at what it was a couple of years ago. This was, let's see. Yeah, this was February 2 years ago. Remember that incredibly cold winter we had. In fact, February 2015 was the coldest month on record of any year in our area and in many other areas as well. So, and then if we go back to last summer when we had almost a record drought, a near record drought, there's a swimming area, but there's hardly anything coming over the falls. Here's another look at it. And this was some morning I came down, I hiked down, and not much of any water, just enough maybe to get the surface of the rock wet, and that was all. So we had that terrible drought, and our waterfalls nearly dried up. Teganic Falls, you practically needed binoculars to see the flow. So now we're going to pop over to Treman State Park and Lucifer Falls, and this is what that looked like a couple of years ago. Let's bring up my notes here. When was that? Well, I don't say. Yeah, I think this was 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. But that winter was very cold, and of course, as we said, and look at the entire face of the waterfall, of the cliff around the waterfall is just covered with ice. And you had to practically need binoculars to see the water flowing there under the ice, not much. And so this is what we like to see. What would be considered optimum amount of flow over the falls there. So I think I have another little video here of Lucifer Falls flowing. So let's take a look at that. You can get up to see Lucifer Falls. That you can't go on the gorge trail by the falls because that's closed because of the ice danger. But you can get to this view rather, I should say, from an overlook on the South Rim Trail. Usually you can get up there, and then that's where it ends. The trail is blocked off from there because beyond that is something called the Cliff Staircase, which is too steep and icy to risk. So, and then there are other hazards in the gorge below, winter hazards. Okay, now we're going to go, as I mentioned, to Sampson State Park. Well, where is Sampson State Park? You may know that park, you may not. If you've been in the area a long time, you probably do. But so let's take a look at this Google map here of a Google Earth photo of the Finger Lakes, Central Finger Lakes. And down in the lower right there is the bottom of Cayuga Lake, and that's where Ithaca is. And then you can see the marker that says Sampson State Park. That's on Seneca Lake on the east, so the northeast quadrant, the shore along Seneca Lake, about 11 miles south of the city of Geneva, which is at the northern end of Seneca Lake. And that's in Seneca County, too. So let's just zoom in a little bit. There's Sampson State Park on the east shore. There's a 2-mile long shore there that you can walk along, and it's mostly wild. So that's pretty cool. And the whole park is, well, you see where it says Sampson State Park, and you can notice that where that marker is right on a highway, which sort of indents into the park just below the label of the park. And that's Route 96A that runs up to Geneva. And so everything west of the highway there, pretty much in this picture, almost all of it, is the state park, over 2,000 acres. To the right of it, you see this area that has kind of a grid in it. That is the old Seneca Army Depot, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit, and after we talk a little more about Sampson. So, well, Sampson State Park has been, its history is sort of bookended by military experiences. Back in the Revolutionary War in 1779, George Washington sent this guy and an army up into the Finger Lakes region. His name was John Sullivan, Major General John Sullivan, and also General Clinton. And they had an army of several thousand troops and went up and down the Finger Lakes and burned all the Iroquois villages they could find and destroyed the crops. And they had a couple of engagements and one battle down near Elmira called the Battle of Newtown, and there's actually a state park there, Newtown Battlefield State Park, commemorating that engagement. And anyway, this was the most of the Iroquois nations were, especially the ones in here, the Cayugas and the Senecas and the Onondagas, the Mohawks, were allies of the British, and they because they didn't want the settlers to come in their area, and the British had been keeping them out. So they were allies of the British, and they would raid frontier settlements in eastern New York and northern Pennsylvania. So that was a pretext for invading the region. And here's a marker for the Sullivan-Clinton campaign army coming up along the west shore of Seneca Lake, right through where the state park is. So this is right next to the park. And it also was the Sullivan-Clinton campaign coming through the Finger Lakes in 1779 was the justification for this part of New York from here west to Niagara becoming part of the United States and New York at the end of the Revolutionary War, as part of the treaty ending the war. Of course, the Iroquois had no say in that, having been sort of deserted by the British. But that's another whole story. But there was a village at what's now Sampson State Park called Candaya that was destroyed when the army came through. And we've got a little bit about that village here. Let's see if I can pull up that information. Yeah. This is a quote from Wikipedia, I think it is. Let's see, what else did I have? Oh, let's see. Well, I was... During the American Revolution, the Sullivan Expedition of 1779 found the village to be the, quote, oldest town we have passed. Here being a considerable orchard, trees, very old as are the buildings, very pleasantly situated about a quarter of a mile from the lake on a high piece of ground. The village consisted of 20 or more houses of hewn logs covered with bark, and some of them were well painted. Here was one apple orchard of 60 trees besides others, also peach trees and fruits. Candaya was occupied either for an extended period of time or multiple times, since a large number of Jesuit artifacts were found dating from the early 1700s. So, substantial town. And it was destroyed by Sullivan's army. But then a hamlet grew up there that kept the name of Settlers Hamlet, and they had a cemetery there until the coming of the Army, again, this time in the form of the U.S. Army during World War II, to create, actually the U.S. Navy, I should say, the military, to create the Sampson Naval Training Station. So we'll be getting into a lot about that momentarily. But so here's a headstone in a cemetery in the hamlet of Candaya, which is no more. Candaya's history is largely one of war and military conflict. The original Indian village was destroyed by Continental troops during the Sullivan-Clinton campaign. After the war, several soldiers remembered the area and returned to resettle the village. So, as many of our communities around here had some of their early settlers were veterans of the war, and particularly of that invasion of this area, because they had seen how nice the land was, and looked like a good place to get start a farm. And many of the veterans were paid for their war service in Indian lands, which happened all over the place, all over the west of the frontier, I guess. So then, let me see what else I got here. Okay. Well, if you drive along Route 96A between the park and the Seneca Army Depot, you'll see a fence on your right-hand side at some point, and you might see what I saw here is a white deer, or you might see several of them. So let's look at that picture again here of the Sampson Park. And to the right, the area to the right of the highway is the Seneca Army Depot, which was created during World War II, or just prior to it. And munitions are stored there, were stored there for many, many years, including nuclear weapons. We'll get into that later. And it was all fenced in. It's like over 7,000 acres. It was all fenced in. So the deer that were in there, they interbred. And some of the deer, about a quarter of the deer, are white deer. And the reason I'm talking about this, because one of the quotes, the last quote I had in the cemetery there was by a group called Seneca White Deer Incorporated. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But anyway, these deer, a lot of people think they are albino, but they're not. It's just the recessive gene of the particular color of the pelt. And you can see just to the right of the deer on the left, just in the center there, there's another deer that just has a normal deer coloration. So actually there's about 200 white deer in the fence there, and then another 600 or so of regular looking deer. And the deer are, because they interbreed a lot, then this recessive gene pairs up with another white deer, another white gene, and you get a lot more than you do normally. Occasionally you see white deer in the forest in other areas, but not in these numbers. So it's become famous for that. And in fact, the Seneca White Deer Incorporated is trying to preserve the deer and turn the place into an ecotourism place. The base was shut down, so but the base did have all those areas up there actually with the you can see the sort of horizontal lines to the right there, and then the little dots along. Well, these are bunkers, roads with bunkers, and these are where war munitions have been kept for many decades, including nuclear weapons. And as a result, back in the 1980s, sort of the height of the arms race, the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, the anti-nuclear war, anti-nuclear weapons movement, spawned the Women's Peace Encampment, which bought a farm in the village of Romulus to the east of the Seneca Army Depot, and then for years staged demonstrations and such, including some civil disobedience like this woman crossing the fence and then getting a citation, but lots of different actions to try to back us off the arms race. And the Seneca Army Depot had said to have had more nuclear weapons stored there than anywhere else in the United States. So that's a piece of history there. And let's get back to the Candia, I'm not sure how many people pronounce that. I think it's Candia Cemetery. And don't worry, we'll get to the park here in a minute. Yeah, this is just interesting side story. Cemetery has over 800 graves, including at least 3 Continental soldiers who served in the Revolutionary War. The site is maintained by a private association. The village of Candia was in the area that the Sampson Naval Training Station, which later became the state park, was created. So the village was destroyed. Some of the buildings were moved elsewhere, and I guess are still there. So we're going into the park. Finally, I'm getting you into the park, and there's a statue. Look between these two flags. There's this statue, and that is a symbol of a assault or a boot. Almost 150 years later, the military, this is after the Sullivan campaign, the military again entered onto the Candia area with its history as construction of the Sampson Naval Training Base obliterated the village, although portions of the village were relocated, that is the settlers' village. The cemetery serves as a reminder of the village's original location. So here's where we come into the park. I guess that caption was for the previous pictures. Sorry. This is where you come into the park and you encounter with this statue. Okay, here's the caption on the statue, the sign actually, which says, Sampson Sailor, this memorial is dedicated to the 411,429 naval recruits and untold thousands of ships, company, service school graduates, waves, and nurses who were assigned to the Sampson Naval Training Station. Sampson was opened October 20th, 1942 until the end of World War II. To our shipmates who made their ultimate sacrifice for their country and those who survived, we, the Sampson World War II naval veterans, dedicate this memorial in 1991. So that's actually, that statue's been taken down and is being repaired. So anyway, this is an aerial photo actually of the Sampson Naval Training Station. Ran through World War II, and then it became Sampson College for veterans, and then in the Korean War it became an Air Force base. But look at the size of that thing. That was thrown up in about 6 months, and there was a sort of a constant population there of about 35,000 people, and that's a little more than within the city limits of Ithaca. So here's a postcard showing the Sampson College. This was after the war, and there's a veterans college here. And then, let's see, yeah, this is the, yeah, that's also Sampson College. But it shows you some of the buildings. They're the same buildings. They used the base buildings for the college. Here's a drill hall, these huge drill halls that were just enormous. And, yeah, here's the, oh, yeah, here's a, what do they call that? World Communion Exercises. And then there's a drill hall being constructed. So they were enormous buildings, and there were lots of other buildings on the site. Here it is during the Air Force Base days, but barracks and so forth. So most of those buildings have been taken down, and a few of them are still being used by the state park, which was created in 1960. So when you come in, one of the first things you see is this sign. So there's two museums there, and there's a building called the Brig, which was a brig, which on the left-hand side of the building was the Naval Museum, and the right-hand side was the Air Force Base Museum. And there are two veterans groups that created the museums. There was one, the Sampson Naval Veterans, and in fact every year for many, many years there was a Sampson reunion for people that went through training in World War II at Sampson Naval Training Station to, just get together with their old buddies. But I think this past year or the year before was the last one for the naval veterans, because they're getting too old. Too many of them have passed away. So it used to be that veterans would actually run the museum. But there's still all veterans run the museum, but not many. Most of the old salts, they called them, Sampson salts or the Sampson boots, are too old to do that now if they're still alive. But it's a pretty nice museum. There's all kinds of artifacts and so forth in there that have been contributed and gathered from various places, including a periscope. You can look through this periscope at Seneca Lake, and then lots of other exhibits. Pretty cool place. When you first come in, there's this panel about Pearl Harbor, uniforms, communications, radio stuff. But then we'll go into the, running down on time here, we're going to go into the Air Force Museum on the right-hand side. Not quite as big as the Naval Station. The Naval Station was, I think, a bigger operation. It was a bigger war. So they've got some planes out there, outside, and inside various artifacts, and also these models. This is kind of cool. And these models of what daily life was like in the Air Force Base at Sampson. Some interesting things there. And it was a brig, so those who misbehaved found themselves locked up in the brig. So that was really the function of that building. There's a few other buildings that form the park office and recreation hall. There is some buildings that are being used for regional maintenance, for equipment maintenance for the Finger Lakes State Parks. So this is the Central Regional Maintenance. This is Dolores, and Dolores is the manager of the museums, and she also has a career with the parks. I guess she's working for the museums now, but she worked for parks for many years. I knew Dolores when I worked for the parks. A wonderful woman, and does a great job. And okay, so there's also the Sampson Naval Veterans, maybe the Air Force Veterans too. I'm not sure if they were involved. One of their projects was to create the Sampson Veterans Memorial Cemetery. So there was a guy named Steve Bull, who I think is probably buried there, who was the president of the Sampson Naval Veterans group that I got to know because I was involved in the initial planning of the Naval Veterans Museum, well, Steve Bull he said, time is not on our side, and so they really had to rush to get things done while they were still around. So the naval veterans have now dwindled down in numbers. But there's a lot of other stuff at Sampson State Park, and we'll just go through it quickly here. Nice waterfront area, nice swimming beaches, sort of like Teganic with a float out in it, not quite as big an area, but pretty cool. And this is looking out there's a pier right next to it, so you can walk out on it and get a view of it. There's the float. And then you can look south along the shore from the pier. There's a marina down there. It's not quite in view, but a good-sized marina and boat launch area. And then there's a campground, which is huge. It's about 309 sites. So, and it's the sort of the RV camp of the Finger Lakes State Parks. I think most of the sites have electric hookups, and it's aimed at the RV crowd. So there are a lot of RV people that stay there. But there's tent sites as well, and there's also some small cabins that have been built. So that's really nice. So there you have it, Sampson State Park. Lots to see there. There's a lot more to see. There's a lot of roads, old military roads that are great for bicycling and that sort of thing. A lot of bird watching. You can hike along the shoreline for like 2 miles, like I said. So, well, we're out of time now. So thanks for joining me to take a look at Sampson State Park. So this is Tony Ingram, walking the park, and I hope to see you again soon. Stay well, stay safe. Let's see, we'll get a parting picture of Teganic Falls while we queue up the